And I'm back. So let's take a look at now the health and safety legislation. We're going to review these 4 different health and safety legislations. As you know, they all change from one country to another. So I'm going to review 4 of the ones that are the most prominent or the most well-known. Well, first we're going to take a look at the Health and Safety Act of 1974. This was passed in the UK, and it is also referred to as HSW and all these other variants. And basically, it was an act of Parliament that sets out the framework for managing workplace health and safety. So this basically, it defines the responsibilities and duties of everyone, from the employers to the employees to everybody in between, in order to ensure the health and welfare of the employees at work. And so the act itself was a primary piece of legislation that was set out by the government, and there have been other variations or complements of regulations which complement the SHW Act, and they are also known as statutory instruments. So basically, the SHW 1974 Act requires that workplaces provide adequate training of staff to ensure that health and safety procedures are understood. They include adequate welfare provisions, a safe working environment, and suitable provision of relevant information. So for example, for a more practical purpose, what is the Health and Safety Work Act, or what kind of policies and workshops could we see that would be taking place? Well, for example, there are countries where you have workshops that HR does, for example, for staying safe in the workplace, or your physical health in the workplace, where, for example, for people who are working at the computer, well, you take a seminar where it says how you are to place your hands, how you are to position your feet. You should always have your feet placed at a 90-degree angle from the chair. You should always sit and make sure that your back, you have lower back support, etc. These are the kind of things that are part of these health and safety regulations in order to ensure that workers are safe in their workplace setting. And of course, even more so when it has to do with people who are working in factories or manufacturing processes where they are dealing with heavy machinery, dangerous machinery, etc. So basically, the HSW Act for 5 or more employees requires that employers must keep a written record of their employees' health and also the safety policy. And they also need to be able to consult with employees or employee representatives, like, for example, unions, on relevant policies and associated arrangements regarding health and safety. And so the HSW regulations actually apply to many different aspects and all aspects of the working environment, and of course require employers to provide a workplace that is not only safe, but also suitable for the duties that are being carried out. And what does this mean? Well, for example, I can tell you from my own experience, when I worked for a importer of jewelry, but it was costume jewelry. So it wasn't real, it wasn't high-end jewelry. It was plastic with beads and stuff like that, but they were for young kids. So for girls who want to dress up like princesses, and they had crowns and they had these kind of things. So costume jewelry. And we were actually working out of the warehouse. And basically what the company had, this was here in Spain, and I worked there for 1 month. What the company had done was that they had set up an area in the actual warehouse with four or five desks, and we were meant to work there year round. And I actually left, and they had a huge problem with turnover because of the bad working conditions. It was cold. It was very, very windy, not windy, or shall we say, it was very airy. So especially in the winter, and I worked there the 1 month, I think it was February or something like that. And of course, since we were in a warehouse, no matter how high they put on the heat, it was still always cold. And of course, we had one of those garage doors that just slid up and down. And so there was no way to actually isolate and insulate the office area. And so we were all cold, and the company had given us all personal heaters, little personal heaters that you could put under the desk and you could plug it in, but it was still not enough. And so I was actually working there with my winter coat on. And I said, Laura, this is not good for you. This is not healthy for you. And the actual working environment, the actual people who I was working with were very nice. I think it was 5 or 6 of us. People were very nice. They had a great flexible working schedule and everything, but the actual working conditions, the physical space in which we were working was horrible, and people would get sick and stuff. And I actually left after 1 month. I said, this is not working out. I'm not going to be here, and I'm going to end up getting sick just because of the poor working conditions. So this is what is also a part of health and safety regulation. Now, who enforces these kinds of regulations? Well, in terms of the UK, the SHW Act is actually enforced by the Health and Safety Executive. It's a governmental agency that is responsible for enforcing workplace health and safety legislation in the UK. But when it comes to actually enacting enforcement, so actually making sure that people are complying, this responsibility is actually divided between the SHE and relevant local authorities. So what are the responsibilities of the employer? And this is not just relevant to the UK, but basically worldwide. Well, the employer must ensure that we are providing adequate and proportional health and safety training for employees. We must ensure that there are suitable procedures in place in the event of an emergency, for example. So if we are working in a manufacturing plant, we need to know what happens if there is a problem with the machine. And that machine either the temperature starts going up, or there's a problem, something gets stuck in it, etc. When employees are in these kind of settings where there's very high noise pollution, vibrations, substances that are hazardous to health, etc., there can also be added legislation that the employers must comply with in order to be able to provide relevant health surveillances as well. So these kind of settings, there may be either shorter working hours, or the employees may be subject to yearly or bi-yearly, every 6 months, they may be subject to, for example, a checkup. Then it's important also for the employer to be able to carry out suitable and sufficient assessment of risks presented to the employees through operational activities. And many times there are actually third external companies that provide these audits. So they will actually come into the company and they will actually carry out an audit, where there are companies that have audits, for example, for to become more productive or to be able to cut costs, etc. There are also companies who provide audits to ensure that there are no health risks being posed to employees in their day-to-day operations. So they will carry out these kind of audits and tell the employer what it is that they have to change. And these specific risk assessments are actually presented both to the employer and to the person who is vulnerable and exposed to that risk. And of course, there is within the company, there will be a person that is specific to ensuring that that health and workplace safety is being carried out correctly. What are the employees responsible for? Well, it's of course important for the employee to adhere to the policies that have been drawn up in order to ensure that that their health and welfare is being taken care of. If, for example, you are in a manufacturing plant and you are, for example, being exposed to heavy machinery where you can get your fingers caught or whatever, and the company has given you iron gloves that you can use in order to minimize the risks, and you are not using them, well, the responsibility is on you because you have not been adhering to the company policy. And of course, you have to make sure that the employee is also utilizing controls, equipment provided in the interest of their health and safety. And it's also the responsibility of an employee. If, for example, there is a specific area of their day-to-day operations where they see that there are risks being posed, then of course they must alert the employer of these things. Then there is the how we report, the RITR, or the reporting of injuries, diseases, and dangerous occurrences regulations, because of course we must prevent, which is the HSW Act, but we also must know how we are to actually work when these kind of things happen. How should we actually undertake these things? So if any of these incidents actually happen in the workplace, we must know how to actually report them and ensure that everything is being done as per the law. So the SHE's RITR page has detailed guidance on what is defined as a reportable incident, who has to report it, how and when to report it, and guidance on how to keep a record of it as well. Now, there's the Health and Safety Commission, which is a statutory body that has been established by the UK in 1974, which is part of the SHW Act. The HSC is basically focusing on preventing injury and death in the workplace. And they also police the workplace to ensure that individuals, other employees, are not putting themselves and others at risk as well. So enforcement by the HSC ensures that duty holders deal with serious risks immediately. They comply with the law, and that each one is held accountable if they fail in their responsibilities, both employers and employees. Then we also have other important regulations, for example, due to the working hours or the working time. And this, for example, I'm using here the European Community Directives regarding working time regulations, which was passed in 1998. And basically, this working time directive requires EU member states, so all the countries that are within the European Union, they must be able to guarantee the following rights for all workers. Number one, a limit to weekly working hours. Now, the limit for a 7-day period cannot exceed 48 hours, including overtime. And depending on each country within the European Union or collective agreements within industry, the 48-hour average can either be calculated over a reference period of up to 4, 6, or 12 months. Now, this directive also includes and specifies that a rest break during working hours must be that there is a rest break, during working hours if the worker is on duty for longer than 6 hours. If somebody is not working for more than 6 hours, then you can just begin your shift and go home. But if you are working for longer than 6 hours, then the company must provide a rest break. And then you also have a minimum daily rest period specified depending on the number of days that you were working. So every 24 hours that a worker has worked, they are entitled to a minimum of 11 consecutive hours of rest. A minimum weekly rest period, for example, for each 7-day period, a worker is entitled to 24 hours, uninterrupted hours of rest, in addition to the 11 consecutive hours of rest that we have seen as minimum daily rest period, and paid annual leave of at least 4 weeks per year. And of course, there is also specified extra protection in case of night work. Many companies actually per law, there are you are bound to pay night workers more than day workers because it is actually hazardous to our health to work at night, because it goes against our natural physiological clock. And that is why there is extra protection granted within the community directives. So average working hours in case of night shifts must not exceed 8 hours per a 24-hour period. Night workers must not perform heavy or dangerous work for longer than 8 hours in a 24-hour period. And night workers have the right to free health assessments and under certain circumstances to transfer to day work. Other health and safety legislations. The Fair Work Act is another statute that includes specific information about mature age workers. So for people who are over a specific age, it sets out terms and conditions of employment and the rights and responsibilities of both employees, employers, and employee organizations in relation to that specific employment. And this act also regulates national system employers and employees. So basically employment that is not covered under the National Industrial Relations System is then regulated by the relevant state industrial relations system. But there are some entitlements under this act that extend to non-national system employees to ensure that mature age workers are being protected. Now, under the Fair Work Act, there are a number of aspects that can present potential opportunity to address legal barriers so that mature age workers can actually not be discriminated against. So these include the right to request flexible working arrangements, modern awards, so that people who have been working in the company for 30 years are not stuck with what they had 30 years ago. Provisions that relate to termination of employment and general protections provisions. So this brings me to the end of the second part of the class. I will be right back with the last part of the class.